I guess I want to begin by saying, in the face of such utter pain and desolation in India right now, it feels a little odd to be talking about words and concepts rather than oxygen, ventilators, and hospital beds. And my heart definitely goes out to all of you who are joining us from India today. I hope, however, that by the end of my talk, I will have made some connections between words and concepts and the situation in India today. I want to build today on Dilip's really wonderful presentation in our last session, in which he gave a call to build theory from the global south. And so in doing so, I ask today what the relationship is between democracy, socialism, and communism as they have been experienced and understood in India. In today's contribution to the Fugitive Words series, I want to draw some examples from my current research and use them to begin a conversation about how political ideas and practices in the South have been shaped in regionally unique ways. I'd also like to simultaneously highlight a series of methods that can help us better grapple with the wide range of both regional continuities as well as regional variations in political histories, meanings, and practices across South Asia. I'll summarize these methodological examples under 4 rubrics, with the caveat that these rubrics are by no means comprehensive. So the first is mapping the terrain of translations, and this is sort of a macro project, and I'll be paying particular attention to collective translation projects. The second is more of a micro analysis in which I track circulations of ideas and awareness of events across languages, using attention to reading practices and citations. The third is tracing how writers have grappled with the challenges of translation, which also points us toward points of untranslatability. And then the fourth is looking for articulations of structural oppositions, things that can help constitute the core frameworks in which and through which politics have been understood in India. I'll be illustrating these 4 rubrics with an eye toward producing a deeper picture of the unique ways that democracy has been understood and practiced historically in Telugu-speaking South India. I want to begin then with an ethnographic encounter from 2012 when I was doing research in Hyderabad on the forms of political practice used in the Telangana movement, which, as we know, culminated in June of 2014 with the creation of India's 29th state. I was chatting with an activist who had been deeply involved in the various state hailing methods used in the then rapidly expanding efforts to hold elected officials accountable to their campaign promises to create the new state of Telangana. And we'd been discussing the various dharnas and processions and road and rail roko blockades and Janagarjana public meetings, and various other kinds of activities that eventually brought the new state into being. And then suddenly he nodded with satisfaction and said with great pride, "I always say that the Telangana movement is one of the greatest democratic movements in the world so far that I have ever witnessed. Not even in the China Revolution did this take place." Startling to those for whom China and its revolution are seen as the antithesis of democracy, rather than its pinnacle, his comments, I think, help to remind us that democracy in India has historically been understood not simply in local terms, as some anthropologists might argue, but rather in transnational terms that differ quite dramatically from understandings in parts of the world that have historically laid claim to being the founders, promoters, and protectors of democracy. This is just one example of among many that I've encountered over the past 3 decades of research in Telugu-speaking Southern India that suggests that our understandings of the history and meanings of Indian democracy, as well as the ongoing ambivalences surrounding it, should not begin in 1947 with Indian independence, or with the implementation of the Constitution in 1950, or even with the slightly earlier introduction into India of British-style parliamentary elections, but must instead be situated amidst the broader myriad of political experiments that were taking place worldwide over the course of the 20th century. Indeed, it's comments like these that have set me on the path of trying to implement the first and possibly most ambitious of the four methods that I introduced earlier, namely attempting to map the broad terrain of the translation of the political. I conceptualize the historical terrain of Telugu political translations at two levels. The first includes publishing efforts that sought to translate political texts, biographies, and histories from German, Russian, Chinese, and other languages, though frequently via English, and with bits of English often still present within the final publications, if only as bracketed glosses or appended lexicons. The second level includes performance traditions. Includes performance traditions that have sought to translate and animate political concepts for broader, often rural and less literate audiences, and involves recording or collecting scripts of Burakatha and Harikatha folk performance traditions, as well as collections of songs and ballads. Since the number of translations of political texts into Telugu over the 20th century has been remarkably voluminous, my method for gaining a macro perspective has been to focus on multi-volume and collective translation and publishing projects rather than just on individual texts or translators. And I highlight some of these Telugu political translation projects during our opening discussion a few weeks ago, so I won't dwell on the range of projects here, except to say that many of these projects had very explicitly defined agendas, often articulated in the form of a programmatic statement or short motto. And this has been, these have been helpful in identifying the goals of each project and documenting what texts or concepts the project has sought to translate, when and why. The earliest of these collective projects, the Vignana Grantham, for example, was quite explicit about the goals of its project. Their very first publication in 1907 was a translation of William Thayer's biography of Abraham Lincoln, which emphasizes his opposition to racial inequality and included a collectively authored 15-page preface. The members of the Vignana Chandraka Granthamandali write in their prefatory statement, the development of language, Bhasha Abhivriddhi, development of knowledge, Jnana Abhivriddhi, and development of the nation, Desha Abhivriddhi, are all synonymous with one another. Before trying to teach different disciplines to students in their mother tongue, we must first produce books related to all the disciplines in that language. After outlining all of the areas in which they see a need for books in the Telugu language, they go on to write, so we, people who shared similar ideas and desired to serve the Telugu language with devotion, have established the Vignana Chandraka Granthamandali, a society for Telugu language development, selflessly with utmost devotion and commitment to serve it. Since it is not possible for anyone to write about everything, we have decided to publish works relating to only 4 subjects: history, biography, physical sciences, and then a 4th category described as other widely used texts in English. And these included classics of liberalism such as Mill's On Liberty and the Subjection of Women, Spencer's Education, and the Scottish Chartist reformer Samuel Smiles' Bible of Mid-Victorian Liberalism, Self-Help, or on Character, Thrift, and Duty. Although many works in the first 3 categories were published, in the end, very few from this last category appeared to have actually been translated by the Vignana Chandraka Granthamandali, including, I don't think Mill's on Liberty was ever translated by them. Nonetheless, the collective did end up publishing 38 books, which in addition to their wide range of translations on various sciences, topics of disease and agriculture, also included biographies, Abraham Lincoln and Ben Franklin, as well as political histories of France, America, the Delhi Darbar, South Africa, India, and Andhra. Also a book on Turkish democracy, Prajaswamikam, under Ataturk in 1933, and 2 volumes on political economy. But let me turn to my second methodological rubric, and that is the circulation of ideas, texts, and awareness of events across languages. And I'll illustrate this method using a second group of writers. And the second group are Telugu writers who produced translations for the Soviet Videsha Bhasha, or foreign language publishing house, and Pragati, or Progress publishers, between the 1950s and the 1980s. At least 6 of this dozen lived for some time in Moscow, but none, as far as I can tell, ever published much of anything in English, and there's almost nothing written in English about these various authors, their lives, or their numerous publications. One of the most prolific of this group, and the only one to leave an autobiography in Telugu, was Uppala Lakshmana Rao. To illustrate how we might approach the question of circulation, I focus not on Lakshmana Rao's vast body of translations, but on his original writings, particularly his Telugu autobiography, Batuku Pustakam, which was published in 1983, 2 years before he passed away. And I want to pay particular attention to the extensive documentation of his reading practices and the citations that he makes of other works. Lakshmana Rao was born in Berhampur, in what is today Orissa, in 1898, and he traveled to, just after the First World War, first to Edinburgh to do his MA, and then to Tübingen University in Germany for his PhD, where he was part of a growing diasporic community of Indians in Germany. He first met Melly Schollinger, then a medical student, in Tübingen in 1922. They became good friends, and upon the eve of Lakshmana Rao's return to India with his doctorate in hand, she promised to come and visit him there. She arrived in India in 1929, and the two immediately attended the Lahore session of the Indian National Congress at the end of that year, where they met both Gandhi and Nehru, and both took a vow to work for Indian independence. Schollinger lived for a time at Gandhi's ashram in Sabarmati. She participated there's a picture of her at the ashram. She participated in Gandhi's salt satyagraha in 1930. She worked in a hospital in Calcutta, serving Dalits, and adopted many of the nonviolent political tactics that were being utilized in the movement. She also spent nearly 2 years in 3 separate imprisonments in prison for her participation in civil disobedience movements. She documented her experiences through a series of reports that were purportedly published in German newspapers. Schollinger and Lakshmana Rao were married in 1937 in, at Schollinger's request, the Soviet Union, which Schollinger argued was the only country where women were considered truly equal to men. Although the two did not join the Communist Party until 1959, a year after they moved to Moscow, they described themselves as its admirers as early as 1930. They were also active members of the Friends of the Soviet Union, which was established in 1941, and later the Indo-Soviet Cultural Society, established in 1946. In 1956, they traveled to Weimar in the German Democratic Republic to attend an international symposium on the revolutionary poet Heinrich Heine, who Lakshmana Rao had translated into Telugu. Lakshmana Rao was then invited to Greifswald University, also in East Germany, where he ended up working until 1958. It was during this period that, at the request of local audiences who were interested in India, the couple embarked on an extensive speaking tour throughout East Germany, speaking on such topics as Indian politics, women's empowerment and the role of women in the Indian nationalist movement, the recent, at the time, celebrated election of a communist government in the South Indian state of Kerala, which was of great interest to people in the GDR, and India's adoption of Soviet-style 5-year planning. In 1958, the two moved to Moscow, where Lakshmana Rao had been recruited to work as a Telugu translator. Coming of age as they did in the context of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, the two participated in and bore witness to the trade union movement, the rise of fascism in Europe, the Indian anti-colonial struggle, Indian independence, and the range of experiments with socialism that occurred in India, Germany, and the Soviet Union following World War II. Now, Although Soviet-funded translation projects are often dismissed as propaganda, the writings of Lakshmana Rao and Meli Schollinger, long before they migrated to the Soviet Union, are filled with a palpable excitement that I think was shared with many others of their generation at the historical transformations that were occurring in the world during their lifetime, and at the experiments with new political forms that were underway. Atluri Murli has traced the channels through which the Russian Revolution comes to be translated into Telugu and inspire a whole generation. And later, the Telangana armed struggle of 1946 to 51, with its commitment to land redistribution, was similarly seen in India and elsewhere as evidence of the global promise of peasant uprisings. Like the Russian Revolution, the Irish freedom struggle also played a significant role in shaping South Indian understandings of the political. We know from Lakshmana Rao's autobiography that the Irish struggle was widely reported on and was a topic of much discussion when he was growing up. Writes Lakshmana Rao, "My grandfather made me read the English newspaper, and during that time he made me acquainted with the Irish Home Rule movement. This was an interest which kept growing in South India alongside the rise of the Indian Home Rule movement." Ogeti Venkata Subbiah Shastri's 1925 Swatantriya Lakshanamu is a translation of McSweeney's Principles of Freedom. McSweeney was the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork during the Irish War of Indian Independence. He was imprisoned by the British government on charges of sedition under sedition laws that are quite similar to those that are still in effect in India today. He died in Brixton Prison in London in 1920 following a 74-day hunger strike, an event that was widely covered in the Telugu media. The Telugu newspaper Andhra Patrika, for example, reported the news of his hunger strike and death, an article that was noted in the native newspaper reports. I talked briefly in one of our earlier meetings about how Venkata Subbiah Shastri's translation of McSweeney's essays appears to have been more influential and important in Telugu than many texts typically considered much more central to the history of liberalism in the West, such as Locke and Mill. But today, I want to draw out Venkata Subbiah Shastri's translations of some of McSweeney's references to democracy. Venkata Subbiah Shastri translates McSweeney's use of the English term democracy as Praja Prabhutvamalu. Praja being people, and Prabhutvamalu is a plural of Prabhutvam, which means power, supremacy, lordship, sovereignty, or government. And it comes from Prabhu, or lord, master, ruler, or sovereign. But Venkata Subbiah Shastri appears to make a distinction between what McSweeney refers to as modern governments and Venkata Subbiah Shastri translates as prastuta, or present day, Praja Prabhutvam, on the one hand, in other words, referring to specific existing democracies, and a second translation of democracy, which seems to be a more abstract and ideal democratic government, which he translates as Praja Rajam, or people's rule, or people's government. Now, both of these, I think, are distinct from the Telugu term that is most often used today for democracy, or Prajaswayam, which contains with it an idea of people's ownership, right, or title. I'm going to return at the end of my talk to the broader context from which these subtle distinctions may take on their significance. But I also wanted to add that the translation of McSweeney's essays is also likely one of the earlier mediums through which the writings of John Stuart Mill made their way into Telugu. And it was certainly not an auspicious introduction for Mill. Writes McSweeney, when an aggressive power, Balavantalaguvaru, looks for an opening for aggression, it first looks for a pretext, and our danger lies in men's readiness to give it the pretext. Such a sentiment as this from Mill on liberty gives the required opening. Despotism, which gets translated as Nirankusha Prabhutvam, is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement, says McSweeney, quoting Mill. We feel a natural wrath at all this, says McSweeney, not unmingled with amusement and amazement. When the sincerest expression of the English mind can produce this, we need to have our wits about us, And when, as just now, so much nonsense and dangerous nonsense is being poured abroad about the empire, we need to pause, carefully consider all these things, and be on our guard. Now, given this introduction into Telugu, it's hardly surprising that Mill, along with other liberal thinkers, have received a less than enthusiastic embrace as foundational thinkers for democratic practice in Telugu-speaking regions of South India. In fact, conceptual links between political imaginations in Egypt, Ireland, Russia, and later China competed quite favorably with the influences brought by the British. And although English language histories often make much of the impacts of Dadabhai Naoroji and others who praise the lineages of British-style parliamentary democracy, a closer look at vernacular sources suggests that these ideas intersected with and were often overshadowed by enthusiasms for other popular modes of democracy, and that there were strong ambivalences, particularly on the part of minorities and marginalized groups, regarding elections and the potential for majoritarian domination. And we see this, for example, in the People's War Group boycotts of elections, or those of the VCK, the Dalit Panthers in Tamil Nadu, as Michael Collins has written about, as well as in the ambivalence of Lakshmana Rao himself about elections that are implemented without safeguards against majoritarian interests. One is also struck by the enthusiasm with which McSweeney's careful justification of the embrace of violence under very particular sets of circumstances is translated into Telugu by Venkata Subbaya Shastri, given the continued history of the defense of violence by Maoists in the Telugu-speaking regions of southern India. And he has three essays in this volume that are devoted to resistance in arms, which Venkata Subbaya Shastri translates as Yuddham, and two others to empire and militarism. It's clear that we should read the translation of McSweeney's essays in relation to the widespread excitement that the Russian Revolution had sparked in Telugu writings at the time, and that we can place these into a longer genealogy that connects the Russian Revolution to the Telangana armed struggle of 1946 to 51, including its battle against bonded labor and its briefly successful redistribution of land, as well as to the ongoing Maoist revolutionary sympathies and debates over the role of violence in the Telugu-speaking region even today. And in turn, it's clear from the circulation of literary production across languages that the Telangana armed struggle itself inspired revolutionary writers and poets throughout India and beyond, even in the German Democratic Republic, held up as it was as a successful example of a Russian-style revolution in India, and as an example of the redistributive justice that was possible for revolutions to produce. The Urdu poet Kaifi Azmi celebrated the Telangana armed struggle in his poem Telangana, and the struggle was spread and supported by the play Mahabhumi, Our Land, written by Shankara Satyanarayana and Vasi Reddy Bhaskar Rao in 1947. More than 125 theater troupes were formed to perform the play throughout the Telangana region, leading to estimates of more than 1,000 performances that are said to have reached more than 2 million people during 1948 alone. The Hindi and Urdu writer Kishan Chandra based one of his best-known novels, Jab Khet Jage, When the Fields Awaken, on the Telangana armed struggle, which in turn formed the basis of Bengali film director Gautam Ghosh's first feature film, also titled Mahabhumi, written and produced by B. Narsingh Rao in 1980, which made the rounds of international film festivals and won numerous awards, and also happened to feature the political balladeer Gaddar, and also in many senses helped to propel him to much wider fame. Given all of this, it's perhaps not surprising then that early Telugu texts devoted to freedom and democracy focused on Ireland, Egypt, Turkey, and the Soviet Union, and later China, rather than the French and American or even British democratic experiments. The same Andhra Patrika news article that reported on McSweeney's death also makes an appeal to the English. Ireland, Egypt, Scotland, Africa, Canada, and India are like your sons. You should look upon all these sons with equality. I mentioned earlier the account of Turkish democracy, Taruska Prajaswamikam, by Ayadevara Kaleshwara Rao that was published in Telugu in 1933. And there were other translations of a series of Soviet writers on Soviet democracy or Soviet Prajaswamyam. Another example of the micro-tracing of the circulation of ideas through reading practices and circulation can be seen in Lakshmana Rao's autobiography. In 1947, Lakshmana Rao was sent to Germany to purchase new equipment for the expansion of the cement factory where he worked as a manager. He describes in his autobiography the books that he and Melly read together while they were there, including Marx's Communist Manifesto, Constitutional Reforms and Revolution, Class Struggles in France, and Wages, Price, and Profits, all read in German. They also read Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, also in German, about which he writes, according to Spengler, Soviet communism and parliamentary democracy are the symptoms when Western culture degenerates. The core of his philosophy is that to save Western civilization from destruction, it is essential to use Prussian militarism and fascism as a weapon to confront communism and parliamentary democracy. That book makes a severe attempt to mislead people on communism, and we were tired of reading that book. He also suggests that this work, Spengler's work, helped to turn students at Heidelberg University into fascists. From it, however, they clearly take the idea that both communism and parliamentary democracy are aligned together in opposition to fascism. They also read in English the book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization by the British Sidney and Beatrice Webb. He writes, they also put forth the question of whether the Soviet Union would produce a new man and answered the questions in the affirmative. Though we had spent only a few days in Moscow at that point, we could relate our experiences with theirs, and we felt thrilled reading that book. It's really wonderful to see the emotion with which he responds to the various things that he's reading. Okay, rather than give more examples, I want to move on to my third example and talk, or third rubric, and talk a little bit about the challenges of translation. Perhaps even more revealing are not the terms and concepts that do get translated into Telugu, but the terms and concepts that actually resist translation. Translations of Marxist literature into Telugu are notable for their ever-present English glosses, offered by translators to clarify key concepts, along with often glossaries appended to the ends of Marxist writings. Telugu writers tend to have little problem understanding the writings of Mao with his agrarian emphasis and metaphors, but they have a great deal more difficulty following the industrial-oriented writings of Marx. And so English appears as a critical language of mediation in Telugu translations of Marx, even for texts that were originally written in Russian, German, or Chinese. Although I've seen the term communism translated as Samajavadam and Sangikavadam, and even as Samyavadam, which with its emphasis on equality is more commonly used to translate the English socialism, most often the English term communism is simply transliterated and left in English. It seems likely that even most of the Telugu translators who worked in Moscow did their translations from English to Telugu rather than directly from Russian. And Jessica Bachman at the University of Washington is currently finishing a dissertation on the Russian archives of the Foreign Languages Publishing House. And she shared the Russian personnel files for another of the Telugu translators who worked in Moscow, Rachamalu Ramchandra Reddy, popularly known as Rara. And he also wrote a collection of, and it's clear that he was probably doing his translation from English to Telugu. He also wrote a collection of essays titled Anuvada Samasyalu, Translation Problems, that really explicitly addresses these ideas of untranslatability. If we add to this the substantial number of Telugu Marxist lexicons and dictionaries, which I've only begun to look at, it's clear that a tremendous amount of labor has gone into trying to make Marxist writings meaningful in Telugu. This also helps to explain the often repeated efforts to translate the same text over and over again. So the Communist Manifesto, for example, has seen no fewer than 7 separate translations, each in a different decade and by a different translator, and often using quite different vocabulary. Another early group of translators that illustrates the challenges of translation was a looser circle of collaborators that included J. Gurunatham, who was the chief editor for the Bhasha Sevaka Samajam, or the Language Service Association. He published the first comprehensive comparison in 1910 in Telugu of the constitution and laws of the US, Britain, and the government of India. A second member of this circle was Unava Lakshmana Rao, who did his law degree in Ireland and who, together with Gurunatham, translated Thomas Paine's Rights of Man under the title Manava Hakkalu in 1908. Here, too, a large part of these authors' agendas was to make the Telugu language more capable of incorporating new, globally circulating ideas, a project that they, too, acknowledged was not without great challenges. The preface to Manava Hakkalu, written by Gurunatham, bemoans the lack of books in Telugu that teach Rajakiya Sastramu, or political science, and stresses the importance of digesting new concepts into Telugu and expanding the power of the language to accommodate new meanings if we wish to pursue freedom, swecha, even if it means loosening the tightness of existing grammatical rules and angering learned scholars. Gurunatham similarly opens his 1910 constitutional comparison, Samsthanaka Trayamu, with a discussion of another challenge of translation, the perils of writing books on political ideas that may inadvertently be interpreted by the British as treasonous. And N. Manohar has pointed out that Gurunatham offers the example of the Telugu term Nirankusha Maina, writing that it can be used to translate three different English words: absolute, despotic, and tyrannic. An author who uses it to describe an absolute government, writes Gurunatham, is in danger of having it be understood to mean tyrannic government, which can potentially open one to accusations of treason. Let me now move to my last section, identifying structural oppositions. I want to conclude by returning to Venkata Subbaya Sastri's translation of Terence McSweeney in 1925 and further contextualizing his choice of Telugu terms. When McSweeney talks about present-day democracy, or what Venkata Subbaya Sastry pluralizes, it's not plural in the original, but it is in the translation, and translates as Praja Prabhutvamalu, he warns that they have the potential for tyranny by the strong. And he contrasts this with a perfect government, which will, quote, consider also the claims of those less powerful. His conceptualization of democracies are systems that, as in Praja Prabhutvamalu, are systems that require you to be strong enough to formulate a claim and sustain it. But he goes on to describe this as the way of tyranny. Venkata Subbaya Sastry elaborates, adding something that isn't in the original. He says, how is this people's rule? Prajarajam. We must call this tyranny, Nirankusha Prabhutvam. A government that overrides the weak is a tyranny, and tyranny is in seed in the democratic governments of our time. By way of conclusion, then, I'd like to suggest that Lakshmana Rao and Meli Sholinger's writings frame communism and parliamentary democracy as aligned together as forces against fascism, and that they similarly saw Congress and communism aligned together against British imperialism, highlighting the fundamentally constitutive roles of the concepts of fascism and imperialism in shaping vernacular understandings of democracy in Telugu-speaking South India as their most critical and defining others. From another angle, Venkata Subbaya Shastri's translation of McSweeney frames present-day democracies as having the seed of tyranny within them and as potentially being unable to protect the interests of the weak. The translation projects that framed people's rule against tyranny and authoritarianism repeatedly invoked the concepts of aggressive power, Balavantalaguru, and despotism or tyranny, Nirankusha Prabhutvam, and provided the overarching structural opposition within which communism, socialism, and democracy were framed. A passage from Unava Lakshmana Rao's 1922 Telugu novel, Malapalli, Sangha Vijayamu, or Untouchable Colony, The Victory of the Union, illustrates the type of discussion of political ideas that we need to be attentive to. Unava Lakshminarayana, who, as I mentioned earlier, studied law in Ireland and collaborated with J. Gurunatham to translate Thomas Paine's Rights of Man in 1908. In his fictional Malapalli, in a speech given by the president of the Adi Andhra Congress, who I believe was based on Bhagirathi Varma, I think, Lakshminarayana incorporates a passage in which the Adi Andhra president is illustrated observing that, quote, efforts were made in France and America to pull down and destroy the ruling class and the religious seats of power and to give them to the movement of the people. But instead of a people's government, Praja Prabhutvam, he also uses the same term Prabhutvam, a government of the rich has come to be, and it is more injurious than it was in the past. Instead of the will of the majority, the rich are holding sway. The working classes are trying to change this situation. In Italy, the factories of the rich have been occupied by workers, and in the end, the factory owners have had to compromise. In Russia, a Soviet government has been established. In short, I think there's a long history of viewing the histories of democracy in France, the UK, and the US in ways that prevent them from being embraced as ideal models for Indian democracy, authorizing instead the many ambivalences that have been felt by minorities in the face of electoral politics. And instead, we find the widespread circulation of Telugu accounts that are invested in ideas of freedom and democracy that focus on struggles and experiments in Ireland, Egypt, Turkey, the Soviet Union, and later China. My point here, and this really I think is the clinching point, is that the production of this opposition required a long history of intellectual labor, the labor of writing, of translating, of peddling inexpensive publications, of performing, and of singing. In the face of the most recent threats to the democratic values of free speech and freedom of assembly, and threats to the Indian Constitution and its definitions of citizenship in India today, we can look back on the history of experiments and senses of possibility and excitement for remaking local worlds. Both the excitement felt by Melly Sholingar and Lakshmana Rao in choosing to travel to Moscow for their marriage, where they believed women and men were more equal than anywhere else in the world, but also the sense of possibility experienced by Telangana state advocates, many of whom experienced something new in their sense of being involved in the building of a new, smaller, more accessible state, which many hoped would distribute resources and opportunities more equitably. We may be tempted to look back on these earlier eras of possibility with nostalgia, but I would encourage us to instead highlight the significant intellectual labor that has gone into producing writings, translations, theater productions, and songs in regional languages. As the authors of the preface to the first translation of the Vignana Chandrika Granthamandali argued, those who know English and those who are wealthy have a duty toward the language and toward the readers of Telugu. Now coming to the educated people, they write, they should help us and others who are publishing books in three ways. They should write books in the Telugu language, they should buy books, and they should educate the public about the issues written in these books. I was asked a few weekends ago to speak at a book release function for the Telugu translation of my friend and colleague Jangam Chennaya's terrific academic book, Dalits and the Making of Modern India. The event was attended by both academics and non-academics. It was hosted by the Hyderabad Book Trust, which has brought out the translation. And it's clear that the translation was reaching a wide audience beyond academics. Similarly, the farmers' protest in Delhi, now in its, fifth month, has been systematically producing its own publications, the Trolley Times, translated into at least 3 languages. During the Telangana movement, there was a flourishing of cultural and literary publishing that occurred in the Telangana dialect of Telugu, which had not previously been widely utilized. It's clear that in some domains and among some communities, translation projects into regional languages are alive and well. But the question I want to leave you with today, and it's a question I ask myself as well, is whether we all are doing everything we can, not just to study the histories of regional language literatures and concepts, but also to influence the shaping of the ideas that are available to think with in regional languages and the structural oppositions that frame contemporary political debates. What kind of translation projects are happening today, and how is the presence or absence of these projects shaping the nature of contemporary political debates? Theories of the political and their circulation within regional languages don't just describe the world that is. Rather, they play a significant role in actually shaping the political, defining what can be thought, what can be recognized as political, as well as what becomes invisible within a system of governance. Thank you, and my apologies again for the problems with technology. I had tried to come on early and test the technology, but was unable to get it to work, so I apologize.
Thank you, Lisa. Others can reveal themselves and we can start the conversation. That was absolutely fantastic, and apologies for being a bit late today. I was wondering if we can start big and zoom right out, because you've got so much detail that is incredibly interesting and very suggestive. And I do wonder if we can start thinking in terms of, what is it that appealed about the texts that were translated overall, as opposed to the texts that we tend to associate with democracy and its universal history and so on. What constellation of values at this very early stage, of course, is starting to emerge? What sorts of ideas, things that really sort of ignited people's imaginations are legible in the glosses that they gave to the terms and in the general sort of project of translating the texts and conveying them. So
nothing like a big question to start with. Yeah, I mean, there's so much I think that could be said in response to that excellent question, Anastasia. I mean, one of the things I'm really struck by is the lack of consensus about how to translate terms. And I'm working with a theory right now that a lot of these political terms don't really stabilize until the 1980s. This is just kind of a working, and I have much more research to do before I can actually make that argument. But I'm really struck by, like, for example, Lakshmana Rao, when he's talking about class struggle, he uses a term that really is more like civil war or internal struggle. There's no element of class. It's only much later that Vargam gets imported, or that gets utilized for class struggle when talking about Marx and Engels. But his early references to Marx's class struggle are more like internal struggle or civil struggle. So that's one sort of example of a the kind of, and I also was really struck. I started looking for the earliest translation of the Communist Manifesto and was surprised at how many different, I found so far I've got 7 different translations of the Communist Manifesto, and it's puzzling why there would need to be so many repeated efforts to translate a text like that. And I think there was a great deal of excitement, and so people were engaging with ideas. There was tremendous effort to develop a language, yeah, anyway, I sort of am interested in hearing what reflections other people may have on these questions, because I'm sure in each of the languages that you all are working, you may have other insights that can help to kind of inform this.
Just to follow, does that 7 translations, did they each have a different translation of the title?
In some cases, yes. They almost all use communist, but then the term for manifesto varies. Okay. And again, I think doesn't really stabilize until much later.
Margaret, I think you had a...
Yeah, I absolutely loved the talk, but I knew that I would love it beforehand. So it's the kind of work that I've always been dreaming that someone would take up to really follow translations in precise detail, and not just the West has been translated, but really to look what are the texts which are translated and which words are used for the translation, and how do they affect the way that the translations are read. Still, I would like to nudge you a bit what is happening outside of the translation. So I completely see one possible argument where there is an excitement, and this excitement triggers off translations, and the translations are precise, and then there is something like a trigger off, a trickle down, and it diffuses and it becomes ever less precise, and then in the end you have a kind of bottom where things are less precise, where you might still have some emotions, but it is, compared to the original, it is less. What would happen if we turn that around? I mean, when I look at the way that concepts and emotions are traveling, are traveling in the Islamic world, very often I have the impression that the excitement and the encounter and a certain resonance happens before the translation. So it is not a precise translation and a knowledge about what do they mean by this term or the other term, but it is something like the term Renaissance or the term awakening or the term young man or the term new man, which triggers off something and where there is a certain resonance. And in many cases, it stops at that resonance, and it's just this resonance just to know that Ireland as well has young men rising and they're creating new men, etc. And that's enough. And in other circumstances, this triggers off a need for translation. So it might be that you have this trickle-down effect, that the translation is first and then it diffuses. But I think it might also happen that you have an encounter which is just based on a resonance of one or two concepts, and then either it may happen that the translation follows, or it doesn't even happen. Would that be something which would resonate with the field that you are working in? And if yes, how do we proceed from there? So is there something like a possibility to systematize that? When does a translation happen? When is the need for a translation felt? And when is the resonance enough?
Margaret, that's such a terrific question. And I think you're absolutely right. I see that in Lakshmana Rao's autobiography, where in fact, you know, he and Melly Schollinger read quite late the actual works of Marx. They read them in 1947, 48. And by that point, in some circles, Communist Manifesto is already, you know, circulating in India or in Telugu. That happens as early as 1934. But it's underground. It's you know, it's contraband. I mean, it's not. There's no author's name on it. But it's clear that there is an excitement that is drawing them to particular texts, and that is then motivating the translations that get done. And I think that's kind of why. I think that's why I'm very resistant to the idea of out of the Soviet translation work that Lakshmana Rao and the other authors who work for the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Moscow. I'm very reluctant to label that as propaganda, because it's so clear that these texts are desired in Telugu. And in fact, I mentioned Jessica Bachman, who's doing a PhD on the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Moscow, and she's worked in the archives in Moscow, and she also has collected letters that were sent by Indians to the press asking for the Foreign Languages Publishing House or Progress Publishers to publish particular kinds of texts, often sciences, but other things as well. So there's a kind of, I mean, what she's been able to capture is a kind of back and forth between readers in India and publishers. And the publishers in Moscow were really responsive to readers, questions and demands and suggestions for publications. So it's very clear that it's a two-way street. And I think your question, Margaret, like shows that there is an attraction to things that cause them to be translated. And I think you're right, that often shapes the ways that they're translated and the ways that they circulate afterwards. But that's, I think, a really important thing, to be attentive to what's outside of the translations.
So I'm going to call on people in the order in which the hands came up. But if you've got a point to make on the immediate point of the discussion, just pop in. No? Then, okay, then John Dunn's next. John, can you turn your... John, if you just press the video icon on the right of the screen and the microphone icon, we'll be able to hear and see you. Okay, actually, I can do this. I think I can do this. Nope, I'll just turn off. Lisa from Expo Platform, can you switch John on, please? John Dunn. Lisa?
Yes,
Yes,
Nastya, he can do it only by himself.
I thought we...
Sorry, I'm not able to do that. I can see it, but I can't.
No. It's the other Lisa who's on the technical side of things. We can't. I thought we were able to switch people on and off now as moderators.
There's possibility to write the question in the chat if...
yes, no, we need a live conversation. Sorry, we need a live conversation. How can we get John to come on? Because he's new to the platform, he hasn't seen the screen. So John, on the right of the screen, there are circles, one that has a video icon and one that has a microphone icon. If you press them, they will go green and then you'll be audible and visible. Okay, well, while John works that out, we will go on to Uday, right? Who's got his hand up.
Right. So thank you so much, Lisa. There's so much in there. I'm still processing. But I was really struck by also, I guess Ram and I were having a conversation about colonial liberalism and how Dalit intellectuals are responding to ideas, even Ghulamgiri, if you look at Pule's work. But we were also talking about Andrew Sartori's work about the Muslim peasantry in East Bengal, looking at Lockean ideas of property and the labor theory of value. But effectively what happens, and I see that Laili is there, so she can give us more details, but somehow there is a way in which in the particular vernacular public sphere, those classical liberal ideas about property and rights and personhood and so on, they seem to be transmuted in the crucible of the the global response to the Bolshevik Revolution, they seem to transmute into something very different from either Bolshevism or classical liberalism. And what it is for Dalits or the Muslim peasantry in East Bengal, or the folks you're talking about, seems to be a big black box that we don't really know a lot about. So I was wondering if there is a wider context of the, say the 1920s, or for example, 1930s. Laili has worked on Maulana Bhashani, and I think that really takes off where Andrew Sartori kind of leaves off. And I think that people have written about the Farisi movement in Bengal as well, the Bengal Delta. And I think that those kinds of movements have really been analyzed by people who really specialize on one part of the region or something. And I do think that bringing them into global intellectual history in the way that you're doing is a massive move.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Uday. I mean, one of the things, there was a certain point, I did not expect to find the volume of translation work that I discovered. And when I began to realize, I was collecting things, and when I began, and I had specific things that I was looking for, but then I found so much else. And at a certain point I thought, oh, this is crazy. If I had a dissertation student who was proposing to do this, I would say it's too big. You need to narrow your focus. But the first of the 4 rubrics that I introduced, if I had not tried to do that, tried to map, and ultimately my way of narrowing my focus was to pick specific translation projects that involved 4, 5, 6 translators, or that did 30, 40 translations in a series. And I've got probably 8 different projects that I'm kind of focusing on right now. If I had not tried to do that, I would not have realized the scope of what was going on. And I think that final conclusion that I kind of come to in what I shared today, that this was an enormous labor. And maybe what we're seeing in India today is that the locations of our labor are very different today. The locations of our intellectual labor are very different in terms of where we're placing our energy and our attention, and where the things we're writing are circulating. I would not have been able to come to that conclusion if I had not attempted that really crazy idea of trying to map the terrain of political translation. So I think you're right, and I think this is not a project for one person, and this is why it's so exciting to be working with all of you in all of your respective languages, because it's very clear this is not just looking at how the Telangana movement circulates across India and even to Germany and elsewhere. You get a sense that of the kind of dimensions of circulation that we need to be able to grapple with. So I see John has been able to join us, and I think, yes, and your microphone is working as well, John. I'm going to mute myself so there's no feedback.
Okay, well, I'll say a little bit. I mean, it is very, very exciting what you've got, I must say, really thrilling. It seems to me that you are going to have a big problem, the set of you are going to have a big problem in seeing how to cooperate effectively, because as has already come out in the conversation this time, I mean, you've picked up a big chunk of the history of the world through what looks like quite a small lens. And the key point is that everyone is going to do that to some degree. And then you're going to have to think about how the different bits are connectable in an analytically instructive way. And I think it's probably a good idea. I mean, you've got a lot of time ahead of you, but you've got one hell of a lot of work ahead of you. Absolutely fantastic amount of work ahead of you. So you're going to need to converge on a strategy to some degree. Otherwise, you are going to pass one another in the night intellectually at the end. I mean, you're bound to. Well, that might not be a great disaster. I mean, lots of wonderful voyages is a very good thing. But of course, some degree of convergence would also be more instructive. And I must say, I was very surprised by some of what you told me. And it suggests all sorts of new ways of looking at the space in which ideas and, well, certainly words, and then all sorts of clusters of ideas around the words, and then all sorts of reference of those clusters of words which come out of different bits of the intensely political history of very, very important places. I mean, it is, Ireland, of course, has been a very important place for a long time, but not in any sort of self-evident way. And of course, everybody knows the Russian Revolution was very important, and you picked up, I mean, a great sort of tsunami of stuff from the Russian Revolution. But Uday, of course, must definitely be right. I mean, what you picked up when it gets to your destination is going to be very, very different from what, I mean, the Communist Manifesto, 7 different translations into one Indian language. I was interested in whether actually any of the translations comment on one another's proficiency, if you see what I mean, or political unsoundness, or their, I mean, sort of intertextuality can be very specific if you actually have published text, because they're fixed. I mean, a lot of what you most want to understand, and certainly what Anastasia most wanted to understand at the beginning, is about what's happening now. Well, what's happening now is happening in part because of the sort of thing which you've traced. But, you know, it's happening because of a lot of other things as well. So it's not going to be so easy to look across that temporal extension. But it is, I mean, the point of what you're doing is to be able to look more intelligently across that temporal extension. Otherwise, it's, in a sense, we're never going to make a significant headway beyond being sort of trapped in little bits of history, or a vast bit of chaos now, if you see what I mean. So I think you do need to think out what your strategy of convergence really in specifying the subject matter. And I think you probably need to start doing that hard now, because it won't be any use doing it hard later on. It was absolutely wonderful. And I hope you've written it all down as well as said it.
Thank you so much for all of that, John. And I'll be hitting you up for reading of my book outlines and chapter drafts soon. But I want to just make one comment in response to what you've said, and say that my own journey to this project really stems from when I was doing presentations on the Hailing the State book manuscript that is now with Duke. I would repeatedly get comments in afterwards that my engagements with my informants in Telangana who use the term democracy, when I tried to capture that and convey that to American and British audiences, inevitably I would get a question at the end: why are you using the word democracy to describe what you're talking about? Well, I was using the word democracy because that's what my informants use, but I was describing things that Americans don't see as democracy. It wasn't the institutions that are, in place. It was the capture of public space. It was, processions. It was, the guy I quote in the beginning of this talk, who compares the Telangana movement to the China Revolution as the most democratic movement ever. He was talking about that in the context of blocking roads and, carrying out processions and doing mega strikes. And so this is really kind of prompted by my own desire to kind of come to terms with the ways that my interlocutors were using the term democracy, often in English, not even in Telugu. So I think you're absolutely right. I feel like this is, I do have a kind of set of chapter outlines right now, but I have a lot more work to do. I haven't even started looking at the Communist manifestos or the dictionaries and lexicons of Marxism, which are, I've got a stack of those that, will take me, years to go through. So let's see, I think there's some more hands. I know I saw Michael's.
Michael, yeah.
Great. I'll briefly jump on and then I'll disappear again. Just to reiterate what others have said, this is a really exciting project. And yeah, there's so much to say right now, but it's so refreshing to hear about a history of understandings of democracy that don't begin with institutions or the extension of suffrage, with elections. And as you've noted, many groups critique elections as a majoritarian instrument. And so, of course, so looking at that beyond just a critique of a current system, but kind of historicizing the genealogy of that critique is just fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to learning more, and I learned so much from your talk. So really exciting work. My question, I think, is much smaller than what you've been asked. It's more of a general curiosity that maybe is something you've looked at, but maybe I'm also preempting before you've done this. But I'm curious in the translation work that goes in from converting a text into a performance, since one of the source materials that you did talk about were bards, songs, performances, theater, drama, these kind of familiar modes of transmitting these ideas to popular audiences. And I'm curious that if you have looked at some of those sources, some of the publications of the performances and the songs, how does the register change? What are some of the idiomatic expressions that are used? How are some of the ideas and the concepts that you described today translated into these more embodied performances? And what does that tell us about transmission? And again, I might catch you before you've gone into that stage of the process, so just love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, thank you for that, Michael. These are all really, really wonderful questions. And you're absolutely right that I've only scratched the surface of this. I've done translations of maybe, I don't know, a dozen probably songs of Gadar that are targeted around specific political concepts. And then I have 2 collections of Burakatha performances. One that was published by the Adi Andhra Social Service League, Dalit organization in Hyderabad, that was really that I've only translated a few of the individual pieces in that collection, but the ones I've translated are on things like the Constitution, understanding rights. There'll definitely be a chapter in this book on constitutional debates in Telugu, because there's a lot. The Adi Hindu Social Service League also was involved in the 1937 constitutional debates and submitted a lot of materials to that. So that's, but yeah, I don't think I have a good answer to that question yet, because I just haven't read things closely enough, and there's just, like John pointed out, there's just way too much material. But so I don't have a particularly comprehensive, except that there does tend to be kind of a focus in like particular songs of Gadar's, where there's a very clear focus. And it often has to do with raising awareness about kind of personifying the audience members' experiences of rights or of methods of engaging with politics. So that, yeah, but thank you for that.
Yep, thank you. Yeah.
Chalapati, or is there somebody else who had their hand up before Chalapati? Microphone. Chalapati, we can't hear you.
Yes.
There we go. Good.
Lisa, thank you so much for a very, very fascinating presentation. It set me thinking about a number of things, parallels, contrasts. So I just want to, ask you about 1 or 2 little things. One is, you refer to, about 7 translations of the Communist Manifesto. What is the shift, the decadal shift? What is it in terms of, is it more, refined, more conceptually refined translation, or is it a different understanding of the vocabulary and lexicon? Because I find in the Tamil context, in the 1930s and 40s, there is a clear shift from using Sanskrit deep-rooted political terminology to a more pure Tamil terminology. To give you one example, something that set me thinking, you use the term Nirangusa Prabhutvam to refer to, absolutist or tyrannical or dictatorial kind of exercise of power. This is a term that Subramanya Bharati uses in the first decade of the 20th century. But this is a term that nobody recognizes today. And, I had to make sense of it through its etymology, from the use of the absence of the goad that is used to tame the elephant. This is how I got to understand this term. So there's a shift here in Tamil from a Sanskrit-oriented terminology to a pure Tamil terminology. And there are refinements to give one very clear example. When there was a shift towards a more Tamil nationalist understanding of text, the famous workers of the world unite, the workers of all countries unite, was translated by the CPI, CPMP plus workers of the world unite. But when the Tamil nationalists started using it, they said, the term that is used is not world, but all nations, which seems to validate their own conception of nationality. And the larger parallel I can see is that, the way Marxist literature was translated, strong parallels to the same debates that animated translations of the Bible. What is the authorized version? Are we closer to an understanding of the deity? Are we closer to the word of God? The same kind of passion and sectarianism that animates biblical translation is seen in the debates about translation of the Marxist classical texts. Thank you.
Wow, Chalapati, there's so much I want to talk to you about. I will say that I have not yet looked at the Communist manifestos. They're one chapter probably, or maybe more. I don't know. Right now, I've been obsessed with the translators who worked in Moscow, and particularly with Lakshmana Rao. And in fact, I had written earlier this week to the archivist at Tübingen University in Germany to see if I could find information on Lakshmana Rao and Melli. And this morning, early this morning, when I was just finalizing my notes for this talk, I got an email back from the archives with not only information about Lakshmana Rao's enrollment at the University of Tübingen, but all the other Indians who were enrolled at the university in the 1920s and 30s. So I have a new sort of kind of opening because I'm really curious, how did he end up in Germany? What were the channels through which, and I would love to retrace his speaking tour in the 1950s, and so that it's very clear that this is not just a unidirectional process. It's not just it's people excited about ideas and pulling them into Telugu, but it's also sharing news of the communist election in Kerala and the implementation of the first 2 5-year plans, and so there. Anyway, we'll be in conversation, but thank you for all of these. And I think your point about the parallels with the translation of the Bible and the kind of authoritative versions of particularly canonical texts like the Communist Manifesto helps actually to make a lot of sense of why there were so many repeated translations. Is that there really was this kind of compulsion to do the authoritative version. I think they get longer as well as time goes by, and but I haven't had like I said, I haven't had a chance to read them all closely yet. Stay tuned. Maybe I'll do another Fugitive Words in the future.
Lipika's got her hand up, but I'm just gonna do a tuppence here. This is all making me think that historians have got to start thinking hard about how to trace the resonances across time, because what Chalapati just said is that the current resonances of certain words are simply absent. They've gone. So if we are, if in trying to trace the resonances now, we can simply do a kind of reverse gloss and say, you know, what did you say? Prabhutam is sort of lordship, mastership, sovereignty, that kind of thing. We can basically, in that reverse glossing, start mapping out the current resonances. But going back, how do we do that? How do we do that sort of reverse gloss? Question for the historians. And Lipika.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Lisa, for your paper. My internet's a bit patchy, so I don't know if I'm able to. I put on the video, but I don't think it's coming on. But I hope you can hear me. Yes, no, I was wondering, particularly with respect to, you know, Marxist ideas, how much of the translation was, the second stage of translation was also happening in between languages within India. So say something from Malayalam to Telugu to Punjabi to Bengali. And you know, if that is something which might come up when you're looking at some of the other texts, because they might have translated something from Russian, but then also be referring to whether there was a translation in Bengali and whether, you know, both can be put together to bring out this Telugu translation to understand terms. So that's just a thought I had.
Oh, yeah, terrific question, Lipika. I am really curious, right, you know, when the first Communist Manifesto was translated into various languages, as well as what was translated and what wasn't. So, for example, I know Junaid Sheikh has worked on the first Marathi translation of the Communist Manifesto, which was 1931. And certainly, you know, there were people in, particularly in Telangana and Hyderabad state, who, you know, read and wrote in Marathi, Marathi, Urdu, or Dakhini Urdu, and Telugu. And you know, just my understanding of an earlier era of multilingualism meant that that was quite possible. I do see, I mean, the example I gave of Ma Bhumi and its spread, you know, across languages, you know, into Hindi, Urdu, into, you know, Bengali film producers, you know, shows that there was some of that. But I think, you know, I'm also limited in the Indian languages that I can read. So I think some of that is going to have to be collaborative, but I would be really excited to do something on a particular text, like to have, you know, a cross linguistic reading of you know, a conference just on the Communist Manifesto, for example, with all of us doing readings of different languages. I think that's a terrific idea, and I think it could really reveal a lot more insights. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, that's something we can definitely think about as part of the exchange we're doing in this project. Thank you, Lisa.
Margaret's got her hand up. Margaret.
Yeah, taking off on what John said, I wonder whether multilingualism as a concept is something that we need to engage more with. So, and it also resonates with the question we've just discussed. So, in how far can we avoid to see the different Indian languages as tight containers where translation is the only possibility to move from one language to the other language? So very often, I think what is happening is that people are simply bilingual or multilingual, and they think in different languages at the same time. And translations are only the tip of the iceberg, and it's only in very specific moments that the need for a translation comes up, because usually you just communicate between the languages without translation. And I would find it very interesting if looking at the communication of Molly and what was his name, Lakshmana Rao, in which languages did they communicate? So can you trace differences in the way that they are talking about certain subjects according to one language or the other? What makes for the choice of one language or another language? Do they Does the content change if they change the languages? Do the emotions change with the switch from one language to the other language? And I think this is something that resonates with all our projects, and it might be something that we want to take up either with a reading group or just to engage more with these questions of multilingualism, because that might be something to draw different projects together. And I completely agree with John that now is the moment to think about that, and not in 2 years from now when each of the projects is well developed in and by itself.
Well, thank you for that, and the way also that it builds both on John and Lipika's comments. One of the really interesting things that I can't completely track is how Melly and Lakshmana Rao, what languages they use between them. He describes when they first meet. They meet at the home of the Latin professor at Tübingen University, whose son is engaged to marry Melly. And they arrive at this, he arrives at this dinner, and there's some incident in the way to the dinner where his clothes get splattered with shit. and she witnesses this and then shows up at this dinner party, and anyway, he says that she speaks no English and he speaks no German. And so there's clearly when they first meet, but then very quickly, the three of them, Hans, her fiance, and Lakshmana Rao and Melly suddenly are like hanging out all the time. And then when I guess one of the things that I think might be a really interesting way to approach the question that you're asking, Margaret, is to think not just about translation as a written project, but think about it as a kind of oral, active, collaborative project. So for example, when he talks about them reading Marx in German and Spengler in German when they're in Germany in 1947 and 48, I'm guessing that when he says we read them in German, that might have been one of them reading aloud and then discussing and translating. I think when they say we read them, I think they probably were having kind of ongoing oral engagement with the texts. And that's a very different way of thinking about translation than the kind of written, from one language to another. It's a much more collaborative. So I think you're absolutely right, Margaret, that we need to think, beyond just the kind of literal translations from it. And some of that we see also in response to Michael's question earlier, the kinds of taking of concepts and turning them into poems or songs or even plays, but very focused concepts often, not texts so much as concepts.
Melinda has been waiting to ask a question, but his hand is not showing. So Melinda, if you're there, please speak, and then it will be Ajay Skari after that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anastasia. I'm sorry, my raised hand function wasn't working. Lisa, that was an absolutely fantastic paper. So inspiring. About Nirankush, it's actually quite commonly used in Bengali today to talk about the word for absolute majority or absolute power is Nirankush Shankhagorishtata or Nirankush Khamata. So I was wondering about the learning effects from different languages, that not only are these languages learning from Sanskrit, but perhaps from each other as well. I could imagine, for example, Bankim Chandra using this, or Rabindranath using this, people reading it in Kannada and so on, which would be a very fascinating thing. But the other thing which I wanted to ask you was in a way, what really inspired me about your work is how you're looking at these vernacular trajectories of Marx's vocabularies. And I've been looking at similar things in the case of Bengal in my book, Mortal God, where I look at, for example, how Qazi Nazrul Islam uses the terms like Kiyama and Pralaya, like the Muslim and Hindu eschatological terms, to actually talk about revolution. But what I'm kind of struggling with myself is, on the one hand, the richness of these vernacular transcultural trajectories, and on the other hand, the hardcore political economic content. So if you look at, for example, the Rajbangshi peasants, how they're conceptualizing ideas like value, or they're thinking about exploitation as the theft of surplus value. And a lot of this is actually coming on, my sense, at least from my own research on Rajbangshis, is from the day-to-day operations of caste and colonial capitalism rather than from reading Marx. Because these are first-generation Bengalis talking in caste association meetings, so it's not really that they're reading Marx. So what I'm wondering is, and Sartori, of course, takes that to a great theoretical extreme by saying that how Bengali Muslim peasants are thinking is not really about any direct contact with Locke or Marx, but purely from the operation of colonial capitalism, which is something I'm a bit kind of hesitant about. I think, in a way, I personally think we need to balance two things. One is the actual transcultural kind of circulation of Marxian vocabularies of like the commodity form, which is translated in Bengali as ponno. And then you have a lot of very interesting gender dimensions as well, like people conceptualizing dowry as commodification of women. This is quite an important discourse among Rajbangshi peasants, and commodification of women and the extraction of kind of commodity surplus value from peasants. But then there is also this kind of Marxian kind of discourse which Qazi Nazrul Islam taps into, which then leads to, for example, he's, I think, the first Bengali translator of L'Ante Nacional. And in L'Ante Nacional, he actually uses a very interesting metaphor of the prison as Doitto Kara, as the prison of the demon, clearly referring to the Kanksha Krishna legend, that the proletariat, the Shardwara are coming out of prison like Krishna came out of the Doitto Kara, of the thing. So I'm wondering, so I guess my long-winded question to you is, because I'm very much invested in the whole global intellectual history project, how are you thinking of balancing these two, kind of these political economy abstraction thing and the transcultural rich register? Because I think, to be honest, this is what I think the future is. We have to do both. We have to do both transculturation and political economy. And I would really love to know more about the kind of theoretical and methodological stakes. And I really hope what you said, that looking at the Communist Manifesto, looking at concepts like commodity, surplus value, commodification of gender, we should look at these, across the multiple languages, because I'm sure there are lots of learning effects from each other as well. And I would love to be part of such a project if you think about that.
Oh, Melinda, I can't wait to read your work, and I'm sorry I haven't already read it. But it just sounds terrific, and I think in some ways this gets back to, I guess, was it Michael who also asked about the kind of popularization of ideas, and I do think that I think what you're saying is absolutely right in terms of the need to incorporate both the political economy and the kind of conceptual. And I guess one of the places where I see that happening in the Telugu world is through popular song, and like balladeers like Gaddar and others, who have been able to mobilize very explicit concepts in ways that have had resonance. So, I mean, I think the Patal Gadi movement is a great example of the way that the Constitution has kind of been taken, and then, stones they're planted with the preface in tribal areas. It's kind of been put to local uses, but it's very resonant. It has resonant. It may not be resonant in the same way that it is for readers of the Constitution. Actually, the first time I ever met Gaddar, I've done about probably 6 different oral history sessions with Gaddar. And the first time I met him in Hyderabad the year before last, he was sitting on a cot reading the Telugu translation of the Indian Constitution. And he was in the process of launching a new movement on Save India, Save the Constitution. There was a picture of his poster. And he had sort of 6 values that he was kind of trying to educate people about. And he had songs for each of those, and songs for the Constitution. And so I think there is a process of pedagogy and education going on. And even the Vignana Chandrika Mandali saw their work as kind of pedagogical, and saw their work as providing a language for people to use. And I guess the kind of conclusion that I led, or that I've organized this talk around today, is that language that is made available is the product of labor, and that it is what makes it possible to think things. And so I think you're right that we don't want to go all the way to an extreme and say that this has just to do with political. Seeing John's comment on singing the Constitution, but I don't think we want to go all the way and just dismiss the introduction of this language. I've done a little bit with the film Bhumi, and the way that the idea of surplus labor gets introduced in that 1980 film. I haven't worked on the popular the play in the 40s, but hope to also work on that and to see how these concepts are being kind of mobilized in much more popular and much more simplified ways. But they're made in a way that or they're provided in a way that provides a language. Anyway, there's so much more that we can talk about. Thank you for all of that. And yes, by all means, let's continue this conversation.
Just a quick addition, Prabhutva is very important in Bengali as well. It's one of the most important discourse, the Prabhu Dasham relation, the master and the slave. That's a very key term in Nazrul Islam, in Rabindranath, everywhere.
And it means mass?
The master-slave relation, the Prabhu Das Shamporko. So this is, I mean, if you look at Nazrul Islam's writings about what is gulami, what is dashatto, and how to overcome alienation, the loss of the self, being swahin, and how to, the revolution would mean kind of a double negation of removing the alienation of the self. So yeah.
Exciting, very exciting.
That sounds like a term that we can have a meeting around, actually, because that's resonated through a number of languages already. Ajay has got a question. Ajay, are you there?
Sorry, I forgot to turn the mic on. Yeah, okay.
And the video, if possible, so we can see you.
Yes. Yeah, so don't creating some problem with the video. So why don't I just, am I on? No, I'm not.
We can hear you. We can certainly hear you.
Okay, so thank you for that wonderful presentation. I love the way that you focus both on what could be translated and what traveled without translation, or more precisely, where leaving it untranslated was itself the form of translation, you know. I mean, in a sense, this is going back to some of the themes that Margaret was raising earlier. You know, as you pointed out, one of the distinctive things about what is being translated is that they are from a minoritized perspective, right? That is to say, from relatively marginal communities, etc. And they're implicitly critical of, sometimes explicitly critical of, mainstream concepts of democracy. And they do so by invoking the people. But as we know today, and as people knew then too, the people has its own way of becoming majoritarian, which I'm just curious to know how they engaged with that, what role that played in the conception of the people, which in a sense also is what you're talking of when you speak of the way that you know, the Constitution is being invoked today, etc. Right? So thank you so much for that again.
Well, thanks for that question, Ajay. Yeah, I don't know that I have a very well-developed answer to your question yet, but it's clear that the critique is not always accompanied with a clear alternative. In other words, it seems to me, just at this stage, John's smiling, it seems at this stage that many of the, you know, including the translations of McSweeney, there's a sense in which there's an ideal government that is opposed to these governments of the rich or governments of the majority, or, you know, the tyranny of the majority, but it's not exactly clear how we get around that. And one of the things, I gave a version of this at a conference at Princeton a couple of weeks ago, and there's Ben Bayer there has just given me a whole bunch of reading around Lenin and the debates around democracy in the Soviet context, and so I'm really looking forward to kind of thinking through some of these debates about democracy that existed not in the Western liberal context, but in other contexts, and trying to bring some of those broader debates into, you know, trying to think about precisely the question that you're asking, Ajay. So I'll hold off from answering it until I've read more.
Sure.
Let's see.
SV has been waiting. SV Srinivas.
Yeah.
Hi, SV.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Lisa. Thanks very much. I really like the way you sort of drew attention to translation. I mean, you didn't bring this out in any detail. I mean, you didn't pay much attention to it in your presentation, but it's really there. That if you shift the focus away, or shift the focus to translation as something that is driven by demands from below, okay, or a particular context. Okay, we know that Congress and the communists were working together, right? And we also know, I mean, from the pamphlet that you yourself mentioned, that this man was worried about, or wondering about why communists and Congress should not work together, and so on. Yeah? So that there were clearly, context-related, factors driving this initiative. But I want to, as you were speaking, I was getting more and more excited by the kind of, perhaps unanticipated from your side, but maybe anticipated as well. But the parallels that there were and continue to be between the adoption of technology, cinema. It would be my concrete example. What does the cinema become, and what drives it, especially in the early years? 1930s, also the age of the sound film, and what was happening there. So the problems that you are, drawing our attention to, I would think, would apply as much to the way Indians have been using WhatsApp and Facebook, as much to the Soviet Union and what they were trying to do there. This brings me to the question, which is the specifics of the case studies that you are drawing attention to are fascinating, and I think you're doing very valuable work by drawing attention to this history. I mean, I knew that there was a Soviet, publishing project. I've read so many of these books, in Telugu as a child growing up, from children's books down to, English translations as well of Marx and Lenin and so on, and Telugu occasionally. But, if you were to look at the problem of what happens to, let's say, the term like democracy, what does it mean? Okay. I'm ignorant, let's say, of this entire history, and I asked that question today: what does democracy mean, or what does revolution mean? That's another term that was being thrown around plentifully through this entire period and all the way up to now. What does the term rights mean? Right? You get a whole set of interesting stories that one has to look at, and a lot of text that one can be looking at, and notice completely strange things that people make of these terms. Okay, both terms borrowed from another context, both terms copiously translated, differently translated, and differently fleshed out by different political formations. And for that, you don't need, you can almost ignore this entire group of translators you're talking about, because what they meant by democracy is no longer valid. I mean, it might, while you are seeing connections between communism, perhaps revolution and democracy, if not communism and democracy. I mean, although not just if not, but additionally revolution and democracy, which might be irreconcilable according to some. Right? So two things basically. One is, if you zoom out and look at the larger question of texts and technologies and systems that travel. I think Dilip was talking about this in the last, what do we make of democracy? And once in a while you hit on this really interesting situation which allows you to take the question back to the West. What does the West make of democracy today? Did anybody get democracy theory right? I mean, did any practitioner of democratic politics ever get democracy theory right? Today we are able to ask that question because we have India, Brazil, and then Trump comes and then he says, no, sorry, boss, and it's everybody's problem, right? So I'm not quite pushing you in that direction, but I suppose in a way I want to echo Professor Dunn's point. How do we begin to delimit this in a manner that it doesn't become a statement about the universal truths of translation or universal truths of things that move.
Yeah, thank you. And this is actually something that I've kind of been struggling with a little bit, to not present this as, and I tried a little bit in the talk to do this, but I'm not sure it came through, but to not present this simply as one-way movement of ideas from elsewhere into Telugu, but rather a kind of attraction and excitement to all sorts of things that were happening both in Telangana, in Hyderabad state, in India, as well as in Europe and other places. And I think one of the things that you kind of point to right at the end of your comment was the way that we can perhaps use this as both a critique of these global histories of democracy, or universal histories of democracy, in order to show that, and again, this gets back also to Melinda's point, that it's the conditions on the ground that inspire the attraction to particular discourses, or the desire to bring them into Telugu and have them circulate. And so I think I'm hopeful that there's a way to discuss that, which isn't just about the imposition of foreign ideas into. Actually, what I want to say is that this is almost more an imposition onto foreign ideas of local needs or of local agendas and projects, which is one of the reasons that I tried to conceptualize these efforts as projects and try to get at what these projects are about, because then you can look at these as tools within a project rather than as kind of the circulation of universal values and concepts. But I am at the same time also very aware of the danger of what I am trying to do. And I think you pointed directly at that danger of kind of making this just one more subsidiary example of the dissemination of universal ideals. And that's not where I want to go with this, but I'd love to talk more and get your feedback on some other things that I've written, and we can maybe continue this conversation, because I do have struggles around that question. So thank you.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, and we've gone far beyond, which is exciting, and I hope we'll go on in the future for hours. But in the meantime, I mean, Lisa, thank you so much for giving, I think, what has so far been the most generative session of the series. And we may not be able to float as one tight armada after this, but we have already got a number of flotillas forming. So, for instance, the Prabhu Prabhutva as a focus of a discussion within a section of the research team, the Communist Manifesto across Indian languages, and I think the idea of multilingualism, which Margaret has floated, is a very, very, very important one, which I hadn't really thought about much, being multilingual myself. I started thinking that it's very, very important to ask, when is the need for translation felt necessary, and why, and when it isn't, and when people code switch or shift between languages and so on. And I think we need to move in that direction. So hopefully Margaret will give us a starter reading list on that. And on that note, we will look forward to the next seminar, which will happen in a fortnight's time. And that will be Udayan Chandra, the last of the core team members, to speak now. And he'll be speaking on Narendra Modi's political theory. And in the meantime, have a good evening, have a good morning, and have a good day, and see you all very, very soon.
Lisa or Anastasia, somebody record the chat, or did somebody save the chat?
The chats are being saved. The session has been video and audio recorded, so anyone who's missed. So Dilip wasn't able to be here today. He's celebrating the completion of a book with hippopotami.
I have a respectful distance.
So yes.
I had a tech problem which might help others next time around. I wasn't able to see myself. I wasn't able to see my hand raised and so on for quite a while. And I texted Chalapati to check whether he could see my name there, and he couldn't. So I refreshed the screen, and I was taken out of the meeting for a second. I went back to the landing page of Lisa's talk, and I joined again, and then I could see my name and my hand and so on. So next time somebody has a problem, please refresh the screen and get back into the meeting.
That's helpful. I also was having a lot of tech problems. So.
Thanks, SV. I had a lot of glitches today. Quite a bit of glitches. Thanks, SV.
And we will work out how to share the screen easily right next time. So.
And I apologize for not checking on that in advance. So thank you all for the really fantastic feedback and comments and questions. This is super, you've given me lots more work to do, but I'm very grateful to all of you.